Welcome everyone to the first episode of Technique Tuesday, where every week we're going to be taking an in-depth look at the lost art and science of training technique. So just as a quick general outline, for the most part, we're going to be breaking each exercise up into 4 sections. So we'll look at the muscles we're going to be targeting, how to set up for the exercise, we'll look at execution of the movement, and then common errors that I see many people make. So without further ado, let's jump right into it with the bench press exercise. So the muscles we'll be targeting here in order of involvement are the pec major, both the sternal, so the mid and lower, and clavicular or upper heads, the triceps brachii, the anterior or front deltoid, and to a lesser extent the lats, but they'll actually only be active when the shoulder is behind the torso, so only at the very bottom of the press. And the primary actions being trained are horizontal shoulder adduction, which will be carried out mainly by the pecs and the anterior deltoids, some degree of shoulder flexion, carried out by the upper pecs and the front delt, and elbow extension, which will be mainly handled by the triceps. Now, before we get into the full setup, I think it's important to emphasize here that you should only try to compare your bench strength to your starting place and not anyone else's bench strength, because there are just so many extraneous factors that can contribute to performance on this lift, like your arm length, rib cage size, muscle origins and insertions, your lumbar spine mobility, the size and strength of your upper back for creating a stable base of support, and on and on. Okay, so the setup on the bench press is extremely important, so you may want to play this back a couple of times. What I'm gonna go through first is technically a strength-focused powerlifting style bench press. However, for reasons I've explained in other videos to do with maximizing load, minimizing injury risk, and optimizing overall pec recruitment, I still think this style of bench press is a great mass builder for anyone with the primary goal of building size. Still, throughout the video, I'll explain some modifications that you can make if you purely have bodybuilding interests. Here we go. First, you want to double check that you have the right weight on both sides, that the bar is centered in the middle of the rack, and that you have a spotter handy if you're training at high efforts. You want to lie flat on the bench with your head back behind the bar, with your feet up on the bench, and you want to squeeze your shoulder blades together, keeping them in this retracted position throughout the whole setup and execution of the lift. Set up your arch by lifting your arms up and grabbing the bar with a shoulder width grip, or you can reach back and push against the uprights of the bench, but I personally just prefer to grab the bar. You want to lift your hips up high while thinking about pulling your shoulder blades to your butt, which will help force you into scapular depression. And push your upper body forward while keeping your feet in place, but you can go up onto your toes if you find you can get more arch that way. Now at this point, you should have your back planted down on the bench and your eyes should be directly under the barbell. You want to position your lower body for leg drive by lowering 1 foot at a time, positioning your feet as far back as you comfortably can, and keep your legs in close to the bench when viewed from front on. Now for regulation technique, your heels should be planted on the ground, so you may have to externally rotate your feet or point your toes out to get your heels down. Also make sure you've dropped your hips down so that your butt is touching the bench. Now you want to take your grip width. At this point, I widen my grip, which is definitely on the wider side since I'm simply stronger with a wider grip. Now it's worth noting that research has found that wider grips will target the sternal head of the pecs and the anterior delts more, while a closer grip will target the triceps and clavicular or upper chest more. But I think using a variety of grip widths in training or experimenting and finding what works best for you makes sense. However, an important factor in determining grip width should be whether or not your joints are stacked from the rear position, meaning the wrist should be roughly positioned over the elbows. However, I think it's also worth noting that some advanced powerlifters won't always keep the joints perfectly stacked so they can get out wider. But in any case, one 2007 study suggests that a max width of 1.5 times biacromial distance, so roughly 1.5 times shoulder width, is best for reducing injury without seriously compromising maximal strength. Another important point when it comes to grip, you want to make sure you have your wrist joints stacked, meaning from the side view, your wrist should be directly below your knuckles. You want to avoid excessive hyperextension here of the wrist, and you can correct this by thinking about punching the ceiling as a cue. Right before the lift off, I'll do one last check to make sure my shoulder blades are retracted and depressed by cranking my elbows forward, which I think of as me sort of screwing my back into position. Now for those strictly interested in bodybuilding only, the same general setup can still apply. However, you won't need as extreme of an arch. You may want to take slightly more of a narrow grip to increase the range of motion, and because your arch will be smaller, your feet can be a little further forward. But still, for the sake of shoulder health and stability, you'll still want to keep your shoulder blades retracted throughout the lift and maintain some arch in your lumbar spine. Now, with that said, I think people do tend to exaggerate the difference in range of motion between a big arch and a small arch, and I think it's worth noting that the distance traveled by the bar isn't necessarily the same as joint range of motion. For example, just compare the joint angles in these two bench press styles. The position of the humerus relative to the torso at the end of the range of motion is actually very similar, despite the fact that the bar will have traveled further in the flat back press. So I think you should get to work on building your arch and just not worry too much about limiting your range of motion when using it. So we've got the bench press set up, and now it's time to actually execute the set. And we're gonna break down the execution into 4 distinct phases. So we have unrack, brace, descend, and press. So first, unrack the bar by having your spotter help you lift out, not up. Or if you're unracking by yourself, you may want to keep your butt elevated for the liftoff component and then drop your hips down once you've unracked. However, I personally prefer to just have a spotter handy whenever going near maximal effort to just help with the liftoff. And at this point, you want to ensure you have 4 main points of contact. So your head, your upper back, your glutes, and your feet should all be planted. And now that you're in position, you want to take a deep breath into your gut, pressing the air out against your belt if you have one. And you can also cue yourself to puff your chest out at this point to expand your rib cage as much as possible. Grip the bar as hard as you can, and you can optionally use the cue to bend the bar or to rip the bar in half, which will activate your upper back muscles to help maintain tightness during the descent. So you want to drop your elbows down at a 45-degree angle relative to your torso when viewed from the top. And there isn't unanimous agreement on this from the best powerlifting coaches, but when viewed from the side on, the elbows shouldn't be too far out in front of the bar, and you can make it a goal to keep the elbows stacked under the bar. And when viewed from the side, the descending bar path should be down and slightly forward at the same time. You want to touch your chest just below nipple level toward the bottom of your sternum, which should be the highest contact point on your chest. You can optionally pause on your chest for about a second until the bar becomes motionless, which is required for competitive powerlifting. But if you're purely bodybuilding, you can simply tap your chest without a pause. Just make sure you ensure that the touch is still well controlled and you're not just bouncing the weight off your chest. So after your optional pause, you want to explode the bar off your chest, driving your heels into the floor, and you want to think about pressing the bar back toward your face and off your chest rather than just driving the bar straight up. You can also think about pushing the floor away from you with your feet to help initiate that leg drive and enforce this back and up bar path. Now, of course, you don't want to press the bar too far back so that it hits the rack or you lose control. Just bring it back into balance over the shoulder joint, restoring that starting position. Now, on the way up, you're likely to encounter a sticking point if training at high efforts, where the lift will feel most difficult, and it's likely where you'll fail the lift if going for a max effort set. Now, research shows that it tends to be in the first 20 to 40% of the movement, so about 3 to 4 inches off the chest, but that will be individual. Typically, the more advanced you are, the lower the sticking point will be. The newer you are, the more it'll be in the mid-range. So to break through the sticking point, you want to make sure you're pressing the bar up and back, not just straight up. You can also try flaring the elbows out a bit more, as this is going to get your pecs more involved to help the triceps. And you can think about lifting the bar off your chest with max speed. That'll also likely help you sort of blast through that point where deceleration would normally happen. But personally, I think the simplest solution is that you probably just need stronger pecs and triceps. So once you're accelerating past the sticking point, you now have the option to exhale, but you can hold your breath until you completely lock the lift out. And as you near the end range of motion, the bar should complete that arc back toward the starting position with the bar back over the nipples. Now at this point, we would just repeat the process, starting with bracing, descending, and pressing again for however many reps your program calls for. So 3 common errors that I see all the time with the bench press are: first, over tucking or under tucking the elbows. The cue to tuck your elbows actually originated in equipped powerlifting, but without a bench shirt, this cue probably won't be as helpful to you. Now, it's probably just as common to see people not tucking enough, completely just flaring their elbows out to be parallel with the bar, And I think this is also not ideal since it puts your shoulder at an increased risk of injury, and it makes the bar path much less efficient since the bar is forced to go straight up and down. Most people just simply won't be as strong benching with completely flared elbows. Now, like I said earlier, a slight tuck is good. However, as you get to that sticking point, more of a flare might help you get the elbows more stacked under the bar and allow you to finish out the lift. If you have difficulty figuring out exactly how you're using your elbows, I'd recommend doing slow eccentric presses with lighter weights, where throughout the entire negative, you're being mindful of where your elbows are and where they're going. Now, the second common error is benching with a completely flat back. Now, you may not need quite as extreme of an arch as a competitive powerlifter. However, maintaining some arch in your spine confers at least 3 major benefits. First, the lumbar and thoracic vertebrae and intervertebral discs are actually safer in the lordotic or arched position. The more decline pushing angle is safer for the shoulder joint, and you'll most likely be simply stronger in this position, meaning more total load is going to be placed on the active muscle groups. Now, the third error that I see a lot is lack of leg drive. If your feet are just positioned wherever or just out in front of you on the bench rather than tucked in behind you, you're just not maximizing your strength potential on the bench press. Now, figuring out how to use your legs in the bench press may take time, but I think it's really important to master.
最优质的训练环境，最棒的训练器材，So Fit 健身魂。